They looked at him the way people look at a mistake. A man in a faded flannel shirt, one hand holding a paddle he hadn't used yet, the other holding the small fingers of a 7-year-old girl with her hair in 2 uneven pigtails, standing in the middle of the most prestigious automobile auction house in Hartford, Connecticut, a room where 3-piece suits and platinum card holders were the only accepted currency. Nobody said anything out loud. Nobody needed to. A slow glance was enough, a half-second pause in conversation, a slight shift of weight away from him, as if proximity itself were a social risk. The message required no translation. You don't belong here. But Isaac Merrill hadn't come to belong. He had come to take back something that was his, and he had been patient long enough. The Voss and Aldrin auction house occupied a converted warehouse on the south edge of Hartford's financial district. Its exterior, modest enough to be easily missed, its interior designed to make every visitor feel they had walked into a different century. The ceilings ran 30 feet high. Warm amber lighting fell from exposed industrial fixtures that had been retrofitted to hold Edison bulbs, each one casting a glow that made chrome trim and polished enamel look like molten gold. The floors were gray Italian marble, and every footstep on that surface made a sound that announced itself a clean, deliberate percussion that suited the crowd perfectly, because this was a crowd that believed in announcing itself. 17 automobiles were on the day's roster. Each one sat beneath its own spotlight, elevated on a low platform, roped off with velvet cord and accompanied by a placard printed on cardstock, so heavy it could have been mistaken for engraved stone. The combined estimated value of the lots exceeded $4 million. The air smelled of leather conditioning solution, fresh ground espresso from the catering table near the east wall, and the particular variety of cologne that announces a man before he enters a room. Isaac noticed none of that when he walked in. He noticed the placard at the far end of the hall, Lot 14, and below the lot number, in the same elegant serif typeface as everything else in this building, words that had occupied a corner of his mind for 14 years. 1967 Ford Mustang, Shelby GT 500, Reserve, $280,000. He stopped walking for just a moment, not long enough for anyone nearby to notice, but long enough for the small girl beside him to look up. Grace Merrill was 7 years old, gap-toothed, and carrying a stuffed rabbit named Pepper that had been repaired with mismatched thread in 4 separate places. She wore a navy dress with white buttons, and her left sneaker was tied with a double knot, while her right was tied in a standard bow because her father had not noticed the discrepancy before they left the house that morning. She was the kind of child who asked questions about everything except the things she could already feel. And she could feel, in the way that children sometimes can, that something about this moment mattered to her father in a way that most moments did not. "Dad," she said, looking where he was looking, "is that it?" Isaac crouched down to her height. "Not yet," he said, "but it will be." She nodded as though this were a reasonable answer, and tucked Pepper more firmly under her arm. The registration desk was staffed by a young man named Jason Whitfield, whose title was Senior Auction Associate and whose gray vest, coordinating pocket square, and gold lapel pin suggested a man who had thought carefully about how he wished to be perceived. He had the practiced pleasantness of someone trained to make every guest feel welcomed while simultaneously conducting a rapid and invisible assessment of their worthiness. Jason looked at Isaac, then at Grace, then at Isaac's flannel shirt, his Casio watch with the black plastic strap, his brown leather shoes that were clean but clearly not new. The assessment lasted less than 2 seconds. "Good morning," Jason said, in the smooth, equidistant tone of a man who has been trained to keep his real thoughts behind his teeth. "Will you be observing today, or are you planning to participate in the auction?" He gave the word observing a weight that made it sound like the more dignified option. Isaac slid the pre-completed registration form across the counter without a word. Jason glanced at the form, at the credit information filled in with unhurried confidence, and reached beneath the counter for a paddle. He extended it with both hands and a thin, professional smile. Paddle 47. It was the kind of smile that said, "By all means, try." Isaac took it, thanked him, and walked with Grace toward the display floor. The crowd at Voss and Aldrin fell into several categories, as crowds at these events always do. There were the serious collectors, quiet men and women in their 50s and 60s who moved through the space the way museum curators move through a gallery slowly, with their hands behind their backs, leaning close to read details on placards that they had already memorized. There were the social buyers, couples in coordinated business casual, whose interest was more in ownership than in automobiles, for whom a vintage car in a renovated garage spoke a language their neighbors would understand. And there were the dominants, the men who arrived already in possession of the room, or at least believing they were. Dominic Hale fell firmly into this last category. He was 45, built like a man who played competitive tennis on weekends and reminded people of it, wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit over a white shirt open at the collar, a matte black Audemars Piguet on his left wrist. Dominic had developed 3 commercial real estate properties in the greater Hartford area in the last 4 years, 2 of which had been profiled in regional business publications. He moved through the auction floor with the particular ease of a man who had never, not once in recent memory, entered a room where he was not the most immediately impressive person present. He noticed Isaac. He could not help noticing Isaac, because Isaac was the sort of anomaly that catches the eye precisely because it does not fit. He said nothing directly. He simply turned to the man standing beside him, his attorney, a thin man named Warren who laughed at everything Dominic said and let one corner of his mouth lift slightly. "I didn't know this was open registration," Dominic said. Warren made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Isaac was standing near lot 14 when this was said. He did not look over. He was crouched slightly, his attention directed at the undercarriage of the Shelby, studying something near the rear axle, with the specific focus of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for. His right hand moved to the outer edge of the rear wheel well, 2 fingers tracing the seam of the metal with the gentleness of someone reading Braille. Jason materialized beside him within seconds. "Sir," Jason said, with the same calibrated pleasantness he had deployed at the desk, "we ask that guests refrain from touching the display vehicles." Isaac straightened. "I apologize," he said evenly. "I was checking the original body seam. This is an authenticated 1967 Shelby GT 500, Jason said. Slower now, as if reducing the complexity of the sentence for someone who might not immediately follow. "I think you can be confident the documentation is thorough." Dominic, nearby with his champagne glass, addressed no one in particular at a volume designed to carry. "Do they not have an invitation requirement this season?" He shook his head with the expression of a man who supports standards in principle. "It's a shame when these things get diluted." The thin sound of agreement moved through the cluster of people near him like a small, ugly wave. Grace stood very still beside her father. She did not understand every word, but she understood the sound of them, the particular tone adults used when they wanted to make a person feel small, without the inconvenience of saying something they could be directly blamed for. She had heard it once or twice before, in other rooms, directed at her father, and she did not like it. She pressed closer to his arm. Isaac put his hand on her shoulder, not to pull her away, not to shield her, simply to let her know where he was. "They don't know us," he said quietly. "Low enough for only her. It's fine." She looked up at him. His face was calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from not caring, but the kind that comes from caring about exactly the right things and nothing else. The main auction room held 120 padded chairs, arranged in curved rows before a raised dais, where Barrett Sloan, the house's senior auctioneer, would conduct proceedings with the smooth authority of a man who had been selling significant things to wealthy people for 22 years. The walls displayed framed archival photographs of notable lots from the house's history. The sound system was tuned to a frequency that made every voice in the room sound more important than it might have been otherwise. Isaac chose 2 seats in the back row, which had the practical advantage of giving him a clear view of the entire room. Grace settled beside him, pulled a small, worn notebook from the pocket of her dress, and began drawing. She was working on a series of illustrated pages about Pepper the Rabbit and his various adventures, a project she had been adding to for several months. She drew with the same focused concentration her father brought to his own work, and she asked no questions once she was settled. The early lots moved efficiently. Barrett's voice rolled through the room like slow water, unhurried and authoritative, placing context around each vehicle before the bidding opened. Isaac watched with the attentiveness of a man attending a performance he has seen before, but in which he is nonetheless interested in the craft. At Lot 3, a 1964 Aston Martin DB5 in British Racing Green, Barrett described the engine as a 3.7-liter twin-cam unit. Isaac's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The engine in a DB5 was 4.0 liters, not 3.7. The error was the kind that only mattered if you knew the car, and Isaac knew the car. He said nothing. He had not come here for Lot 3. Lot 5 was a 1961 Jaguar E-Type Series 1 with a 2+2 coachwork configuration. The paddling opened at 90,000 and climbed to 168,000 in under 4 minutes, driven up by a bidder from the second row who was pushing with the confidence of a man who has decided he wants something. What the bidder apparently did not know, and what was not stated in Barrett's description, was that the body panels on this particular example had been professionally respray finished sometime in the previous decade, a fact visible in the slight texture variation along the driver's door shut line, if you knew to look for it. The original buyer would be paying well over market rate. Isaac watched this play out. He made no move to intervene. Near the wall to the left, Eleanor Voss stood with her arms folded lightly, observing the room with the calm efficiency of someone who has conducted this analysis hundreds of times. She was 42, the co-founding partner of Voss and Aldrin, and she had learned to read auction rooms the way weather readers read skies, by accumulation of small signals rather than any single dramatic indicator. She had noticed the man in the flannel shirt when he walked in. She noticed most things, and this was more interesting than most. When he shook his head almost imperceptibly at Lot 5, she turned her attention toward him more fully. She saw paddle 47 resting across his knees. She saw the child drawing in a notebook beside him. She filed both observations carefully. Lot 8 passed, then 11, then 13. Grace had finished a 2-page spread featuring Pepper the Rabbit negotiating passage across a large puddle via a series of stepping stones, each stone labeled with a number. She showed it to her father without speaking. Isaac looked at it, nodded once, and returned his attention to the front of the room. Grace took this as sufficient praise and turned to a fresh page. Then Barrett's voice changed. It was subtle, a slight drop in tempo, a small deepening of register the way a conductor shifts just before the main theme arrives. The screen at the front of the room shifted from the previous lot's documentation to a single wide-angle photograph. Highland green, matte deep, the color of old forest and old money at the same time. Chrome trim, white rally stripes running from hood to trunk in 2 parallel lines. A roofline that sat low and purposeful, suggesting not elegance but intention. Lot 14, Barrett said. 1967. Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500. Original VIN confirmed. 428 Police Interceptor engine block. Factory original, matching numbers. Highland green exterior, factory color, no respray recorded in the vehicle history. One of 187 surviving examples in this configuration with confirmed provenance documentation. Reserve price, $280,000. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been for the earlier lots. Even the people who had been half attending carrying on murmured side conversations, checking their phones under the edge of the table, had stopped. There was something about this particular machine that communicated itself without requiring explanation. Even those who knew nothing about muscle cars from the 1960s recognized that this was a different category of object. Isaac did not move, but somewhere behind his composed expression, behind the stillness he had trained himself to maintain in rooms that wanted him to be nervous, a door opened, and through it came Salem, Massachusetts, in late November. And the smell of engine oil and cold concrete, and his father's hands. Thomas Merrill had been a mechanic since the age of 17, the son of a mechanic, with no formal education beyond a trade certification and an understanding of internal combustion engines that bordered on the intuitive. He had purchased the Shelby in the spring of 1989 from a neighbor who was moving south and didn't want the complication of transporting it, paid $4,200 for it, money he had been setting aside in a coffee can under the workbench for almost 3 years. He called it the car that listened, because he said it was the only thing in his life that never argued back, and working on it, opening the hood, getting his hands into the mechanical truth of it, had a way of settling whatever in his mind, refused to settle otherwise. Isaac had grown up beside that car, the way some children grow up beside rivers or forests. It was simply part of the geography of his childhood, a fixed point around which other things were measured. By the time he was 12, he could identify every component beneath that hood by feel alone. By the time he was 16, he could hear a timing issue in the exhaust note the way a musician hears a note slightly off pitch. His father taught him not with formal lessons but with the natural transmission of a man who loves something and wants his son to love it too. Thomas Merrill died on the 7th of March, in the year Isaac turned 22, from a cardiac event that had been building undetected for years behind the day-to-day business of a man too busy and too proud to attend a doctor he couldn't afford. The hospital bills arrived afterward, stacked and methodical, and the house was liquidated to cover them. The Shelby went into the estate sale on a Tuesday afternoon. Isaac stood in the garage doorway and watched the man who bought it back out slowly onto the street, and then watched it turn the corner and disappear. And he did not call it back because there was nothing left to call it back with. That had been 14 years ago. Isaac had spent considerable portions of those years, whenever his work allowed him the margin of time and attention, tracing the car through title transfers and auction records, and the network of specialists who maintained informal knowledge of significant surviving examples of American muscle. He had come close twice. A sale in Memphis, 3 years prior, which he arrived at 6 hours too late. A private listing in upstate New York that dissolved when the seller died and the estate went into probate. Both times, he had absorbed the disappointment with the same composure he brought to everything, and gone back to the search. He had come close again, 4 months ago, when a contact forwarded him a listing through the Voss and Aldrin announcement mailing. He had read it once, put his phone down on the kitchen table, and sat in the quiet of his house for a few minutes before Grace came in and asked him if he was hungry. He told her yes, and he put the date in his calendar. Now the date was today, and the car was 30 feet in front of him, under a spotlight, exactly as it had been in his father's garage on 100 different evenings, when the overhead bulb cast the same long shadows across the same Highland green hood. Grace looked up from her notebook. She watched her father look at the screen. She didn't know the story, not the whole of it. She was 7, but she knew the edges of it, the way children know the outline of the important things their parents carry. She reached over and put her small hand on his arm, not saying anything, just registering that she was there. Across the room, Dominic Hale was already engaged in a whispered conversation with Warren, gesturing toward the screen with his champagne glass. "I want this one for the Westport house," he said, at a volume calibrated for Warren but not exclusive to him. In the garage, under the good lighting, it'd be unbelievable. He considered the screen for another moment. "This is what I came for." Barrett opened bidding at $180,000. 3 paddles lifted. The room contracted, the way it always does when something real begins. In under 90 seconds, the bidding crossed $260,000, then $280,000, and the reserve was cleared, and there was a small stir in the room as the boundary between preliminary and serious collapsed. 2 of the 3 early bidders fell away. One man from Boston, attending via a paddle registered to a collection he managed for a private client, pushed back in when the number reached $295. Dominic matched him. The Boston bidder moved to $325. Dominic raised his paddle. $355,000. The room breathed again. Barrett acknowledged the bid with a nod and looked out over the assembled rows. Isaac still had not moved. Grace had put her notebook away. She was watching the front of the room with the careful attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand. Pepper the rabbit sat in her lap. The Boston bidder considered his client's ceiling and lowered his paddle at $340,000. The room looked at Dominic with the particular expectation they reserve for a man who has clearly already decided. "Do we have any further interest?" Barrett said, unhurried, scanning the room. From the back row, without urgency, paddle 47 rose. It was not a dramatic gesture. It did not call attention to itself. It was simply the act of a man raising a flat piece of numbered plastic at the appropriate moment, which was exactly what paddles at auctions were designed for. $360,000, Barrett said. "New bidder, paddle 47. Dominic turned his head. He looked at Isaac. The flannel shirt, the Casio watch, the child beside him with the stuffed rabbit. He processed this information against the number that had just been placed, and he arrived, quickly and with what felt like solid logic, at a conclusion. This was a gesture, not a bid. An overextension. The kind of thing that sometimes happened when someone became emotionally engaged with an object they had no realistic expectation of actually acquiring. He allowed himself half a smile. 375,000, he said, and raised paddle 12 with the ease of a man swatting a fly. There was a small sound from somewhere in the room. Not laughter exactly, but the social cousin of laughter, the noise people make when they believe they have correctly interpreted a situation and wish to register that interpretation without committing to it fully. Jason Whitfield, stationed near the wall, shifted his weight. His eyes moved from Dominic to paddle 47 and back, calculating. 390,000, said paddle 47. The small sound stopped. Jason crossed the room and measured strides, and crouched beside Isaac with the practiced discretion of someone trained to deliver difficult information without public spectacle. "Sir," he said, at a volume that was not quite a whisper, but nearly so, "I want to make sure you're aware that all bids are legally binding, and payment is required within 24 hours of the close of the auction. Our team would need to verify your financial instrument before—" "Thank you," Isaac said. He said it without hostility and without warmth. He said it the way a man says thank you when the words have no further meaning beyond the social transaction they are completing. Jason straightened. He went back to his position by the wall. His ears were slightly red. Barrett looked between the two active paddles with the practiced neutrality of a man who has witnessed every variety of auction drama and finds them all equally interesting. "We have 390,000 with paddle 47. Dominic, he caught himself and corrected to the professional form, "We have 390,000. The room is open." Dominic raised his paddle. 400,000. A beat. 425,000, said paddle 47. The room shifted its orientation the way a compass needle shifts. There were now considerably more eyes on the back row than there had been 30 seconds ago. Dominic's half-smile had resolved itself into something that was no longer entirely comfortable with being called a smile. He studied Isaac from across the room with the particular expression of a man recalibrating. He looked for the tells he had been trained to read over a lifetime of negotiations and acquisitions, the slight tremor that indicates overextension, the over-deliberate posture of a bluff, and he could not find them. The man in the back row was sitting with his left hand on his knee, his right hand holding paddle 47 in a relaxed grip, and he was looking at Barrett Sloan with the patience of someone waiting for a slow elevator. 450,000, Dominic said. His voice was level. The slight edge in it was perceptible only to those who knew what his voice sounded like without an edge. Barrett looked to the back row. Grace looked at her father. Isaac was looking at the front of the room. The overhead lights caught the line of his jaw, the slight set of his shoulders, the quality of stillness that some people are born with and others spend entire lifetimes unsuccessfully attempting to acquire. He raised paddle 47. 500,000. The room went silent in the way that rooms go silent when the thing that was expected to happen has been replaced by something no one expected at all. Not the silence of emptiness, but of suspension, every person present briefly pausing their own mental activity to attend to what was actually occurring. Dominic Hale stared at the back row. Warren said nothing, which was the first time he had said nothing in approximately 45 minutes. Barrett, whose voice had remained perfectly calibrated throughout the entire session, let a single beat pass before he spoke. $500,000, ladies and gentlemen, paddle 47. Jason Whitfield, from his position near the wall, had taken out his phone. He was looking at the screen with an expression no longer made of professional pleasantness. Dominic raised his paddle. 520,000. He turned back to look at the far row after he said it, and there was in his posture now the recognizable architecture of a man who has been surprised and does not intend to let that surprise determine the outcome. 550,000, said paddle 47. It came without delay, without consultation of notes or companions, without the small visible calculation that most bidders exhibit when numbers reach this altitude. 580,000, Dominic said. A pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Then paddle 47 came up, slow and unhurried, as it had been every time. 620,000. The room did not make any sound at all. Dominic Hale looked across 120 chairs at the man in the back row, and for the first time in the afternoon, he looked at him the way you look at someone when you are actually trying to see them rather than confirming a prior assessment. He saw a man in his late 30s, not physically imposing, sitting very still, with a small child beside him and a numbered paddle in his right hand, and an expression on his face that communicated something Dominic had not encountered frequently in his 45 years. Not aggression, not anxiety, not the theatrical confidence of a man playing a role, something older and quieter than any of those things. A man who knows exactly why he is where he is. Dominic Hale lowered his paddle. He did not lower it dramatically. He did not throw it down or push it away or make any gesture that could be interpreted as defeat. He simply allowed it to settle onto his knee, and he looked at Barrett, and he said nothing. 620,000, Barrett said. Paddle 47, going once. 620,000, going twice. His gavel was already held at the height from which it would fall. He looked once more at the room, as professional courtesy required. Then the gavel came down, and the sound of it rang through the marble and the steel and the amber light. Sold. Lot 14. To Paddle 47. The response in the room was unlike any that had attended the previous 13 lots. It was not applause, though there was a small scattering of it, reflexive, from people who were not quite sure what they were clapping for. It was more like exhale, the room letting out a breath it had not known it was holding. Jason Whitfield stepped back toward Isaac's row with his clipboard, and the expression of a man attempting to reconstruct his professionalism from constituent parts. Before he reached the end of the aisle, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. He stopped walking. He answered the call quietly, turned slightly away, listened for approximately 15 seconds, and then stood very still for a moment before he put the phone away and resumed walking toward the back row, but with a different quality to his step than he had carried in any of his previous approaches to this location. From the side entrance near the stage, a door opened, and a man walked in with the easy stride of someone who considers most rooms to be rooms he belongs in. He was in his mid-40s, taller than average, with the kind of build that suggests physical work done earlier in life, and the kind of silver and brown hair that suggests it was some time ago. He wore a navy suit and no tie, and he scanned the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who already knows most of what he needs to know about it. Cameron Rourke had been Isaac's closest friend since the years they spent working together in a small independent garage in southern New Hampshire, when Isaac was 24 and Cameron was 26, and neither of them had any idea what they were eventually going to become. They had rebuilt engines side by side, eaten lunch from foil wrappers on the hood of whatever car was currently in the bay, and argued about soccer with the passionate specificity of men who had a great deal of time and nothing particularly compelling to do with it. Cameron had subsequently built a successful vehicle investment and advisory firm, Heritage Auto Partners, with offices in 3 cities and a client roster that included several institutional collectors and 3 sovereign playing wealth funds. He found Isaac without difficulty and crossed the room to him. They shook hands, and Cameron gripped Isaac's shoulder with his free hand and said, with the cheerful directness of a man who has been friends with someone long enough to dispense with most preamble, "You were here the whole time. I thought you might lose your nerve." "When have I ever lost my nerve?" Isaac said. "Never," Cameron said. "That's why I said it." Eleanor Voss had stepped fully out of the wings now. She was an attractive woman in a composed and efficient way, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of posture that requires no effort because it has been structural for years. She crossed the room toward Isaac without hurry, extended her hand, and said his name before he offered it. "Isaac Merrill," she said. "I'm Eleanor Voss." He shook her hand. "I'm sorry for any disruption." "On the contrary," she said. "This is the most interesting lot 14 we've had in 3 years." Jason Whitfield arrived at this moment, with his clipboard lowered to his side. He addressed Isaac, and his voice had the texture of a man who is attempting something that does not come naturally to him. "Miss Merrill, I owe you an apology for the interactions earlier today. That was not the standard of service our house is meant to provide." I know how to complete the paperwork," Isaac said simply. "Thank you." Jason nodded once, and stepped back. Dominic Hale had not left. He had remained near the front of the room through the initial post-auction shuffling, his champagne glass still in hand, the contents warm by now. He came forward when the cluster around Isaac thinned slightly, because Dominic Hale was, if nothing else, a man who felt the need to close things rather than allow them to close themselves. "Good bid," he said to Isaac, deploying the tone of someone delivering a professional assessment. Isaac looked at him. Dominic continued, "I would have done more research going in. Next time." Isaac's expression did not change. Grace had begun to fall asleep against his arm, Pepper loosening slightly in her grip. He adjusted his arm to accommodate her weight before he answered. "That car doesn't belong in Westport," he said. "Not with animosity, not with satisfaction, with the straightforward certainty of a man offering a correct observation. It needs someone who knows how to listen to it." He turned away. Dominic Hale stood with his warm champagne and nothing further to say. Cameron settled beside Eleanor near the display, where the Shelby waited, patient and green and indifferent to everything that had just occurred around it. He told her what he knew of Isaac's history with the car, speaking easily and without embellishment, the way people speak about things that don't require inflation to be impressive. He mentioned the firm Isaac had built, Ironwood Restoration, which had acquired and rehabilitated 43 historically significant American automobiles over 9 years before being purchased by a Japanese investment consortium in 2019 for a figure that Cameron named without dwelling on it. He mentioned that Isaac had served as a consulting appraiser for 3 major auction houses, one of which, he noted with a slight pause, had been Voss and Aldrin in 2017. Eleanor listened to all of this without interrupting. When Cameron finished, she said, "I know. I looked him up after Lot 3. She glanced toward the back of the room, where Isaac was settling the sleeping Grace across 2 seats while he spoke with the paperwork team. "I recognized the way he shook his head when Barrett got the Aston Martin wrong. You only make that face if you already know the answer." Cameron smiled. "He's always been like that. He knows 10 times more than he says. He was that way when we were 24 and barely getting by, and he's the same now." Eleanor looked at the Shelby for a moment. The Highland green caught the light in a way that made it look almost warm. "How long has he been looking for this car?" 14 years, Cameron said. Eleanor was quiet for a few seconds. "My father had a car like this. He sold it to pay for my first year at university." She paused. "I never looked for it." "You still have time," Cameron said. She considered this. Maybe. The paperwork took 40 minutes. Cameron managed most of it with the practiced efficiency of a man for whom this kind of transaction is routine. Isaac signed where indicated, spoke when spoken to, and spent the remainder of the time looking at the car from wherever he happened to be standing, the way you look at something you have imagined seeing for so long that the reality of it still requires confirmation. While Cameron handled the final documents, Isaac stepped away briefly and stood at the velvet rope, looking at the Shelby from arm's length. Grace was still dozing in the padded chair behind him, Pepper tucked against her side. The car sat in its spotlight, paint deep and still as a lake. He did not touch it again. He simply looked. Lot 14, 1967. His father's hands on this hood in the cold garage in Salem, the radio on low, the sound of a wrench settling into its proper position on a bolt that had not moved in years. The specific weight of a Saturday afternoon in November, when there was nowhere to be except exactly here, and no knowledge required except the knowledge already accumulated, and nothing more valuable in the entire world than the understanding of how something broken could be made whole again. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from Eleanor Voss. "If you need a transport team that handles cars like this, we can arrange it. And if you're ever available, I'd be glad to hear the story of this car over coffee sometime." He read it. He looked at Grace, who was stirring slightly in the chair, Pepper dropping from her loosening grip. He typed back, "I'm available." He went to his daughter and lifted her gently from the chair, tucking Pepper back into the crook of her arm. She made a small noise and settled against his shoulder without waking fully. He picked up paddle 47 from the seat beside her, looked at it for a moment, and set it on the chair. Outside, the October afternoon had gone the color of old brass, the particular quality of light that Hartford produced on autumn evenings, low and amber, cutting across the granite and glass of the financial district at an angle that made ordinary things look significant. A hired car waited at the curb. Isaac carried Grace down the front steps, with the practiced ease of a man who had made this carry thousands of times, opened the rear door with his free hand, and settled her into the seat, drawing the belt across with the care he brought to everything that mattered. He sat beside her and pulled the door closed, and the car did not move immediately. The driver was completing a route confirmation. Isaac sat in the brief quiet and looked through the window at the front entrance of Voss and Aldrin, where a few guests were still filtering out, and at the sidewalk beyond, and at the street where the October light was running out. He thought about the Shelby, currently in the custody of the transport team Cameron had arranged, who would spend the next 3 days performing a complete mechanical evaluation before releasing it for delivery. He thought about the garage at his house in West Simsbury, the one he had spent 2 weekends last spring retrofitting with new fluorescent overhead lights and a proper drainage system, the one that currently sat empty and waiting. He thought about the morning he did not know which morning, but he knew it would come when he would hear the transport vehicle in the driveway and go out to meet it, and the door of the truck would open and the ramp would lower, and he would hear the sound of the engine turning over for the first time in the context of his life. He thought about his father, not with the heaviness that had attended these thoughts for the first years after Thomas Merrill died, but with the particular quality of completion, not the end of grief, which does not end, but the end of a specific kind of unfinished business. There was a rightness to this that had nothing to do with the money or the bid or the expression on Dominic Hale's face when the gavel came down. The car would come home. Not to the home it had known before. Nothing returns exactly to what it was, but to the next iteration of that home, the one where Thomas Merrill's granddaughter would grow up knowing what it looked like and what it sounded like, and something of where it came from. That was enough. That was more than enough. Grace shifted against him, still not fully awake, her voice carrying the soft imprecision of someone halfway between sleep and the surface of the world. "Did we get it, Dad?" "We got it. Is it coming home?" He looked out the window as the car finally began to move, pulling away from the curb and turning out onto the main street, carrying them north toward West Simsbury in the last of the autumn light. "It's coming home," he said. She settled back against him and did not ask anything further. She already had the answer she needed. The car pulled forward through the copper afternoon, past the stone facades and the glass towers and the ordinary streets where ordinary things occurred every day, unremarked upon, unremarkable, except occasionally, when a 14-year-long patience finally arrives at its destination, and the thing that was lost comes back to where it was always meant to be. Grace slept. Pepper rested in her arms, repaired thread and all. Isaac watched the city give way to suburbs, and the suburbs give way to the particular quiet of the Connecticut countryside in October, and he said nothing more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said.